Hello and welcome to this special session that MCCIA is hosting, the series on AI at work, AI applications, where we are talking to experts and gurus of AI who are actually implementing AI in their companies and at their customers in various capacities. And today we are very happy to welcome one of the veterans of the IT and startups of Pune, Monish Darda, who's been in this industry for 3 decades now. So he looks a lot younger than that. He is the CTO and co-founder of Icertis. He's been a serial entrepreneur before that. We have done some interesting sessions in the past with MCCIA about his startup and entrepreneurial journey. Today's session is not going to be focused on that. Today's session, in the limited time we have, is going to be completely focused on AI. Both Monish's personal insights, view about AI, as well as how Icertis, which is one of the pioneers in this space in the world, is planning to use AI or is already using AI. So that's the objective of this session. It should be a 30-minute session, and let's hope we will get some good insights from it, right? So let's get directly into it. I'm not going to do a long introduction of Monish. As I said, suffice to say, he's a 30-year veteran of this industry, originally a Punekar, studied in US in Florida, has been through multiple startups which have scaled up to become big companies. And most recently, for the past decade, he's the CTO and co-founder of Icertis, which Monish, and that's going to be my first question, is no longer a contract management, but a contract intelligence software company. I noticed that change recently. So can you quickly talk about what Icertis software is doing?
Yeah, so Amit, first of all, thank you. It's always a pleasure talking to you. Really appreciate this. And thank you, MCCIA, for the opportunity. I think we have done some really interesting sessions. I hope this becomes one of those as well. So yeah, I think Icertis, I don't know where you get these inside news, but yes, we are going through a positioning exercise. And the importance of AI as it comes through in enterprise software has become so progressively important. And it's not just the hype. I think it's interesting if you go back to the hype cycle, as you call it, AI is still actually not down the hype cycle. It's still climbing up, which means there's a lot more to go before it becomes, kind of completely mainstream, which is interesting because, every aspect of your life is governed by AI today, believe it or not. And I'll take some examples as we go along. But for Icertis, then contract intelligence becomes a very natural segue into making sure that our systems, our platform, the value we provide to customers is not just data, but knowledge. And if you look at the definition of intelligence, which is very interesting, I kind of was surprised when we went through this positioning exercise, how we actually relate to that definition is the acquisition and application of knowledge. So it's not the acquisition of knowledge only, but it's also applying the knowledge. And that is what we are making, these computer systems do. And that's what is
interesting. Sorry, I didn't give a specific introduction to Icertis itself, though most people in Pune are very familiar with it. But for some of our audience outside Pune, Icertis is one of the top startups in Pune. It achieved unicorn status over a year back, so we're looking for something much bigger soon than a unicorn. It is a cloud-based contract management software company, and doing some very interesting work in this space, has got some marquee names as top customers in this space. So I think our session today is going to be focused more on enterprise software specifically. If you remember, in this series, we did a previous session with the chief data scientist of Flipkart, Mayur Datar, last week. And that was more B2C focused. Today, we are going to focus completely on the enterprise software, the B2B side. So let's get to some of the machine learning or AI application areas, right? Now, one area that you're looking at obviously is understanding contracts, and contracts often are unstructured data, right? I mean, they're often text, right? They're legal documents, but they're text. So how do you see AI playing out in that area? And especially if you take us to through some of the history. I mean, 10 years back, 20 years back, we had a different approach. We had expert systems. We had a rule-based approach to looking at some of this content. Today, with progress in NLP and overall AI, we are looking at it a different way. So how do you see that evolving, and what is the current status of that?
No, that's a very interesting question. And as you said, we do enterprise contract management, and now with contract intelligence as we go through this positioning. But what is interesting is if you take a look at that, everything that you do usually, even in your personal life, and then obviously at a much higher level in the enterprise, is actually driven by the contract. So, for example, when you're paying your electricity bills, when you're renting a car, when you're taking a flight, you are actually signing a contract in the background, whether you know it or not. Someone is promising you to take you from Pune to Bangalore and back safely, and in a given amount of time with a certain quality of service. And for that, you are paying. And essentially, a contract is like that. So if you think about what happened, 10, 15, 20 years ago, the legal parts of the contract were always a paper document. You signed it, you threw it away. If you went in, you got yourself into trouble, then you dug it up if you could find it. Most of our customers actually started with the fact that they couldn't find their contracts. Mm-hmm. And you can imagine really large companies, right? Mm-hmm. Some of the top companies in the world. And that problem became even more bigger and even more relevant in today's world, because now the whole compliance scenario has changed. You look at GDPR, right. You look at all of these compliances that you need. You look at the way Facebook got itself into trouble over Cambridge Analytica. It all mm-hmm. boils down to compliance. And as more and more compliance comes in, the value of the contract and the value of the intelligent management of the contract increases. So that shift we have seen in the last decade, and even before that, very starkly. But in the last decade, since we've been in business, immodestly, I might say we redefined what contract management was, mm-hmm. and now we'll redefine what contract intelligence is, or define what contract intelligence is. What we have done is we've taken that kind of static document. So if you think about a contract as a PDF or a Word file, or even a printed set of pages, how do you take that and connect it to its environment? For example, what are you selling in the contract? Mm-hmm. If it's a sales contract, or what are you buying if you're buying? How much are you paying for it? If somebody doesn't deliver what they have promised in the contract, what are the penalties involved? What are the discounts involved? What bonuses would you give? Right. So if you think about even an employee contract, you will have stock options, you will have a non-disclosure, you'll have a non-compete, you'll have this specific provision that you will work out of the Pune office. Mm-hmm. If you're asked to go and work in the US, you will. Mm-hmm. Those kinds of terms and conditions are promises made in the contract. You want to now take them out of the contract, mm-hmm. and insert them in the business process. Right. So when somebody is actually approving your expenses, they should see that it is actually goes down back to your employment contract. And especially in these times, pandemic times, where these things surface hugely in people's mm-hmm. right? So, for example, a large services company, which is our customer, SI, systems integrator plus IT services company, one of the top 5 in the world, had a contract with one of the top insurance companies in the world. Now, when you look at that contract, the contract states that all of their 3,000 people that this services company is people who are working for that insurance company have to work from a particular office mm-hmm. of that company. Right. Now, in the pandemic scenario, it's obviously everybody's gone home. So what happens to the security? What happens to the contract? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Does now the insurance company pay the SI? Does the SI, have the privilege or have the right to have employees work from home because this is a force majeure event? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if you relate it to the OMG, Oh My God movie by Paresh Rawal, mm-hmm. you'll see that, this force majeure thing can play a very big part in how compensations are done, how
Right,
contracts are negotiated. And we've seen, because we have those AI, that AI tooling right into our platform, we have seen these queries increase. We have seen people actually now negotiating force majeure clauses in the last 4 months much more intensely than they were doing today. Than they were doing before. You can actually then, if you can kind of connect the dots, you can start getting more insight in your business. How would you react? How are other people reacting? And then you can make these decisions much faster.
Right. So let me interrupt you there. So force majeure clearly has been one term that almost everyone in the industry has learned, whether they have anything to do with legal or contracts or not. But I think you defined a good perspective of the overall contract management, what contract management is, what are the different rules. But going back to my earlier question, now there was a way of managing contracts in the past, right? Assuming that information is digitized in some form, right? I mean, let's say it was a paper document, but it's in digitized form. But still, there were some rules or some fields or things like that. Now we are looking at free text, right? How is AI going to help? I mean, ultimately, what you're trying to do is do better decisions using contracts, right?
That's
Enforcement, analytics, future business decisions. What role is AI playing in this, and what was it playing in the past?
Right. So previously there was no application of AI in contracts to speak about, zero. This is this contract management was also always perceived as a repository of contracts where you could search, right?
And or a back office to be used only in case of a dispute or something.
Exactly. Or when you want to renew or amend, right? So those were the typical large complex use cases. Which were fairly bread and butter, and even today they exist, but it's still bread and butter. But take an example of a large company negotiating with a supplier who they have had a relationship with for the last 10 years. Okay, so in 10 years they have probably signed 50 or 60 large contracts with this supplier, and maybe a few thousand statements of work, because they've been continuously giving business to this supplier. Now you want to expand this supplier's area in, let's say, Australia, right? So now you want to use the supplier's supply chain to supply you parts in Australia. What has that relationship been in the last 10 years is usually knowledge that enterprises very easily lose over a period of time. What AI allows us to do is now take that knowledge and surface it. And take a very simple example. If I want a contract to be signed in Australia with Acme, who is my supplier, I can query and say, hey, show me all of the contracts with Acme where the payment terms are different than our standard terms of net 30 days. And then even from that text, this information can then be kind of extracted or discovered by using AI and machine learning. And then you can then take an informed decision in terms of how you can negotiate when you're doing business in Australia. Now, this is a very small example of how you can actually go deep. But think about this, that the contract is actually touching your environment in many different ways. There are people involved who sign it, approve it. There are processes involved where you make payments, you have discounts. There are other contracts involved. Okay, and what AI can do now is take that text and make it a network. Right? And then once you know the points that connect, once you know that Amit is actually looking at Acme and Amit is also looking at another company, B Incorporated, and Acme and B both are housed, let's say, or are manufacturing plants in China. And now because of what is happening in the US and in India in terms of Chinese supply.
China connection, right?
Exactly. You can say, hey, there's a big risk here now, right? Both of my top suppliers that Amit is managing for this particular type of things that we buy are now both in China.
So it becomes a good decision support tool for your overall business planning and business contingencies and but going back to that specific text that you're looking at, right? I mean, clearly legal and contract obviously deals a lot with the legal domain. Legal domain itself is now exploring AI and natural language processing in a big way. to do some of the paralegal work, which is looking at large volumes of past data. And I guess it's something similar here as well. When you have dealt with a large number of contracts with other customers or suppliers in a similar category for a similar product, you obviously have a lot of information to glean from, right? Specifically, I want to get to NLP, or natural language processing, right?
Yeah.
What's your sense? I mean, we hear a lot of NLP as a buzzword, specifically in this context of AI application, when you're looking at unstructured text information, right? But
Yes.
Do you think it is ready for prime time? Are there issues with it? Do you see it evolving over the next few years? I mean, clearly we have come along a long way compared to where we were a few years back. But what is the latest on that right now? And we're looking at you as one of the application leaders in that field, applying NLP to unstructured text data.
That's right. No, so actually it's a very interesting question, and there's a lot happening that we are also working on very actively. So one small example I'll start with is, take a look at the word termination. Termination of a contract from a contract perspective is actually a very, very interesting, very big thing, right? Very important part of a contract. How do you terminate? How do you get out of a relationship if the relationship is not going well? But if you do a Google search on termination, most likely you will find Terminator as your top hit, the movie.
Right.
So there's a very big contextual information in there, where you've trained that model. Right. And NLP works on, how these models are trained. There is some basic kind of information that you can glean, which is called named entity recognition. In a contract or in a news item, can you find the name Amit Paranjape? Is Amit tweeting a lot, which means, he actually appears in a lot of searches, which means when you see Amit, there's a possibility that it might be Amit Paranjape. Right? So that is the named entity recognition. It recognizes the name Amit Paranjape set of words and says, hey, here's a named entity, which could be a person. Similarly, Icertis could be an organization. Similarly, Pune could be a location, right? So those named entities are the ones that from some of the fundamental things that you can do with NLP, right? You get these named entities out. Then you look at semantics. Then you look at, hey, what does this mean? What does these phrases of words mean? So if I have words that are, closer to each other, then I can infer that this is actually a jurisdiction clause or a payment terms clause. So natural language processing actually then goes deeper into, finding meaning in the sentences. Right? Not necessarily semantics, but at least inferential meaning in the sentences. And then you have this GPT-3 kind of passive things, right? Where
I'm glad you brought up GPT-3. I was going to talk about it, but I think let's step back. Can you give a 2-line, 3-line background of what GPT-3 is for our audience?
Oh yeah. So it's interesting. So if you think about how much data you have, if you glean all the text in the world, right, or on the web, the published text in the world, and then you train a model based on its complexity in terms of what are the things that you will measure when you train the model. You will have science fiction stories, you will have movie scripts, you will have business websites, all kinds of stuff, right? The number of parameters that you define this on that actually builds that model determines the complexity of the model. Okay? And now the more parameters you have, the better, theoretically at least, the model will be, right? Because you're considering more factors.
Correct. You're learning from more factors.
Factors. So there was this great video that was going around by Sundar Pichai, where Sundar actually has a conversation, who's the CEO of Google, has a conversation with a hairdresser, but it's not Sundar speaking, it's actually, a machine learning language, speaking. Now that conversation needs a lot of context of, why you go to a hairstylist. When do you go to a hairstylist? How's your schedule look like? So there's a lot of information that has gone in already for that conversation to take place. And that's the model, right? So that something that is coherent can come in based on historical data of what conversations happened in the past. And GPT-3 is the cutting edge today, as you probably know. Last year, we had about 1 billion parameter models. GPT-2 was there. There was a whole lot of models. BERT was there in terms of what complexity, and that was about 1 billion parameters. Earlier this year, Microsoft launched their own Turing model, which was 17 billion parameters. Right. So from 1 billion in 2019, in January or February, Microsoft went to 17 billion. Okay, and this month, I think, beginning of this month, last month, GPT-3 was announced, which went to 170 billion. So it's kind of exceeded the Moore's law in terms of
absolutely
right. And what that means is the more complexity you add, the more natural the output of that is in a conversation like this. So you can tell the GPT-3 model to write a poem. You can tell it to write a novel. You could tell it to have a conversation, because now you have all these billions and trillions of megabytes of text that it has ingested.
Right.
All these parameters that it can actually figure out some connections between them, the most popular connections between them. And today itself, somebody forwarded me an email where GPT-3 has actually been has written passages of a sci-fi novel.
Right.
As you read that, oh my goodness, it seems real. So
when does GPT-3 start writing full-fledged contracts and essentially replace some of the contract people, I guess, who are drafting these?
Yeah. No, I think so. This is interesting. So there have been some experiments with GPT-3 with contracts, actually. Some published, that we've seen coming out early stage. I think the problem is that you can actually generate stories, you can generate fake news, you can generate a lot of very structured text out of it. But contracts are much more than legal. I think many people don't realize that a contract is not just from a lawyer's perspective. A purchase contract deals with quality. It deals with promptness of delivery. It deals with whether a particular part meets a particular engineering specification. Lots of other people involved.
Correct.
And that is very hard to do. This kind of
it becomes very domain specific, and the more domain specific it gets, it's not just language. It's not like writing a poem. You need to understand that domain and the business rule associated with that domain. So that's the difficult part, right?
That is the difficult part. Yes, and there's one more nuance which is very interesting. That I gave this example of termination in a contract and termination as a search term in Google. The context is very different because Google has been trained, because most of the queries that happen are not for termination of contract, they happen for the movie Terminator.
Right.
So you get different results, right? That's how it's trained. And the mass of contracts compared to the mass of data in the web is very, very small.
Right. So there's a lot more learning to be done. And maybe in some of the more traditional public domain legal cases, it could be done faster than enterprise level contract management, right? I mean, there's probably more legal cases out there on some property disputes, let's say. Those will be thousands of them in the public domain. But business to business contracts, first of all, they may not be in public domain for you to just go and learn about some of these things. So I think, I see your point. But I think going back to the GPT-3, I think all of this is pointing to a huge scale problem, right? And to handle this crazy growth, which is beating Moore's law in terms of parameters, the AI is considering when it's analyzing contract management type scenarios. When I say Icertis specifically has been one of the pioneers in cloud-based enterprise software, specifically for contract management from day one. How are you adapting that or using your cloud-based architecture specifically from an AI standpoint? Because I think scalability is a big challenge for AI in general. And in this context, as we can see, it's probably and even bigger than some of the other AI problems out there.
Yeah, no, so actually it is, scalability actually is not a problem anymore if you know how to use tools and of course if you have money. So the interesting part of GPT-3 also is that if you want to retrain GPT-3, or there's something called transfer learning, where you take what GPT-3 has learned and give it additional data to train it on a different domain, for example. That whole training, because of the large data set, is all based on how much money you have to retrain the model. And some estimates of retraining something like GPT-3 have been, pretty much 150, $200 million. So if you think about it, there is, if you have $150 million or $200 million to train a model, you can actually, and if you have the data, of course, then you can actually apply, and scale is not a problem, because Microsoft used very special purpose NVIDIA GPUs to do all of the crunching beginning of the year. GPT-3 has their own hardware preferences in terms of how they run this, but this is all about having the money. The cloud has actually enabled us to scale as much as we want, as at least in practical boundaries. So last month itself, we took all of our contracts that our customers have given permission for to ingest, and we ran a query on it where we spawned 10,000 virtual machines, each of 16 crores. So 16 crores each, 10,000 machines running for 2 hours. Wow. And that's a lot of compute power to throw at text, right? And we could do that because, first of all, obviously, we could afford it, but because cloud technologies like Azure and platforms like Azure allow us to do that. Spawn containers and do batch processing, which is serverless, which allows you cloud scale. And I think that is the power of what we can do today that we could not do even 2 years ago. Very hard for a company of the size of Icertis 10 years ago to say we will run 10,000 VMs. It just wouldn't happen, right?
Yeah. And so I think, clearly from the cloud architecture standpoint, and it's going to get cheaper and cheaper. So you will be able to train bigger and bigger models. Yes. The challenge is always going to be data, right? So, you can look at the contracts that a company has, or say your customer has, right? And you can train that data for that particular customer. But as your model becomes richer and richer, right? And obviously, there's some learning that you may use across verticals, across customers as well, right? That's enterprise software. You typically use, that's a product company. Otherwise, it will be a custom services company, right? Yeah. At what point do some of these issues, and this is definitely not an Icertis specific issue, this is an AI issue for all enterprise software companies, where at what point do these customers, and many of these are large multi-billion-dollar customers, start getting worried about the learning that you're getting into your general model to be used in other scenarios, and where do you draw the line? And it gets a little bit, this is an issue that has come up in the past in a few other contexts as well.
Yes. No, I think there are two parts to this question's answer in terms of how we address it and how a lot of companies are addressing it. Well, not many, but they will have to address it.
Correct.
Right. One is the ethical side of it.
Right.
Do you have the permission to use the data? That is absolutely critical. And making sure there is a lineage, there's an audit, making sure that you're only using the data that you're permitted to use specifically, that you're not misusing the rights that you have. That part of it is the ethical side of AI. Not just the ethical AI, which is traditionally, is your data not biased, right? That's another aspect of ethical AI, but really, are you using the data the way the owner of the data meant it to be? I think that is very critical. And from a contractual perspective, we are also extremely careful to make sure that we do have the rights, if the data is being used from a specific customer. The second part of it, which is equally important, is what is called as explainable AI. How do you get these?
Yeah, I was going to come to that separately, but go ahead. That's.
But this is an incredibly important part of this question, because you have to make sure that you have the rights to the data and those rights are not misused. The second one is you want to make sure that you're using the technology in such a way that the decisions you come to can be traced back to that data, or at least the collective distilled data, not probably the exact contract, but saying that, hey, 50 contracts or 5,000 contracts or 5 million contracts actually show me this pattern. And that is why I am recommending this decision. And remember, we don't do any legal recommendation. These are all insights in terms of running the business, right? So when you do that, you want to make sure that AI is completely explainable.
Right.
And I think that's an important.
No, I think this is the segue, because I wanted to get to this part. In any case, this is beyond contract management, beyond Icertis. Obviously, you have worked with a lot of different enterprise software over all these years. I think the biggest challenge in enterprise software, or one of the biggest challenges, is going to be what you just mentioned as explainable AI, right? How do you explain the results? And I have some personal experience from my past life, 25 years back, when I was working in a supply chain management optimization company. And at that time, we were also trying out some new algorithms. Some of them were precursor to modern day AI, simulated annealing being one of them. But one of our biggest challenges at that time was exactly this, which is we used to come up with some results, and a planner who was doing that job for last 20 years used to say, that's fine, but explain this to me. Why is this machine being scheduled this particular way, or why is this part being ordered from this particular supplier? And the simplest answer we could give to them at that time was, hey, it's global optimum, so don't worry about all these local decisions. But obviously that didn't fly. And sooner or later, of course, technology has come a long way, hardware has come a long way. So it's not even funny comparing the kind of things that we were dealing with at that point of time. But suffice to say, at that time, we ended up, in most of the cases, moving back to heuristics or very deterministic, rule-based optimization or planning, right? This global optimum or unexplained results was impossible. And I think that is still very much a problem as we do some of these very complex things. And I think it's one thing to do it in a B2C or in a gaming context or something, and there you can just admire. Going back to this famous Go example where the machine beat the top player for Go. And there everyone was talking about how the machine came up with scenarios that even the top Go champion couldn't figure out. That's fine in a gaming context, but in a business context, I think that may not fly, right? The business user is going to say, this is fine, but tell me how. So where do you see this going, and how do you think it needs to be addressed fully before we move forward? And again, there I want you to put on the overall enterprise software hat. So look at logistics, look at supply chain, look at marketing, all application areas, right?
That's right.
Or is it going to be a stumbling block which is going to obstruct or impede the progress of AI in this area?
Yeah. No, so I think like almost everything else, and obviously there are very big notable exceptions, these decisions, technology decisions, are always fueled by money and convenience, right? So the reason why we are okay with sharing all kinds of stuff on social media is because we get something in return. It's not very different in the enterprise. If you do something, if you share something and you get more in return, you're happy to share, right? So I think it is not going to be a stumbling block, but it is going to be a compliance kind of, not even a block, but a compliance regime that you have to deal with as an industry. One interesting thing there, of course, is if you think about autonomous cars, right? Obviously, nobody can say that an autonomous car will not be involved in an accident.
Right.
There's no such thing.
Yeah.
Nobody can say that there won't be an accident. There was an accident.
There was an accident in Arizona
exactly
3 years back involving a Uber test vehicle.
Exactly. Right? Yeah, because there was a mirrored surface on the truck in the front, and the car thought there was nothing there because there was a reflection of the mountains behind it. So these kinds of things can make any intelligence, artificial or natural or human, go wrong, right? Now the question is now, how quickly can we go to a place where we are okay with those mistakes? Right? So in the measurement of accuracy of AI results, there is a precision and there is a recall. There's a way to figure out what is a false positive and a false negative, and how many of these are there. And it's heuristic. So it also, even this explainable AI business becomes slightly harder, because sometimes with the same input, you get different results.
Correct.
Right. So this is a heuristic. It is not a deterministic rule-based inferencing. It is actually heuristic. As soon as it is indeterminate, in the sense that it is driven by a unique combination of numbers, especially when you go to deep learning and so on, and you really don't know internally how this works very well, this becomes even more important. So what you're now looking at is averaging it out. How many exceptions do I have? How many wrong decisions do I have? And that trade-off, enterprises have been making them for hundreds of years.
Right.
That you take a decision, out of 10, if you get only 3 wrong, you're actually on a good side. So decisions being right in an enterprise is very, very good. Right? I think that is going to continue. That is how AI is going to evolve very quickly. I don't think there is any stopping it. I think the stopping will happen with regulation, with compliance, and data.
Right. I think what you're saying is right. I think inside the enterprise, they will be able to make these kind of calls, because you're not going to get it 100%, but if you can explain it 80% of the time, I'm fine. The problem is going to come, and that's where I think the regulators will get involved, is when these happen at the boundary of enterprises, between two enterprises, when you're dealing with two different entities. That's when this will start directly affecting, back to our original topic, which is contracts, which is, you promise something, but based on, if you have AIs on both sides planning the demand and supply, you may not be able to explain why some things didn't get fulfilled or got fulfilled the wrong way or whatever. I think that's a whole long discussion. I think maybe we should do a separate, and I guess one way to look at it is that's a good problem to have if we get to that level of complex AI applications.
So just to kind of finish that off, what's interesting is that now people are going back. We are also doing the same thing. People are going back and saying, okay, forget about AI. How many mistakes did you do as humans negotiating?
Right.
And is this better? So the benchmark is now actually very interestingly against humans.
Right. Of course.
So
that's true. No, I think, as I said, there's so much to talk about, but I think we're pretty much out of time. We just have 5 more minutes. So I'm just going to ask you 1 or 2 quick questions, right?
Sure.
Let's fast forward.
Is that a rapid fire round or?
No, we don't do rapid fire. I'll just give you 2 questions, right?
I'm kidding.
Let's fast forward to 2025 or 2030, your choice, right? How do you see AI again in the enterprise software space? Not restricted to contract management, but overall, what do you see AI doing?
Yeah, no, I've attempted to think about this, and I actually have some strong opinions as well. But I think one thing fundamentally people agree on, that this is going to be an indivisible part of our lives. Personal as well as professional, in the enterprise as well as in personal life. I think there's no escaping that, right? What is in the enterprise software space and the SaaS software space, which is probably the largest growing segment of software anyway, I think the clear trend there is going to be consolidation of data. How do you take that data, central data, terabytes of data? Mayur also, in your previous episode, he talked about how storage is cheap and compute is cheap. So much data coming in the enterprise is going to give people, many interesting ways of disruption. And what is going to happen is the regulation, the compliance on how you use that data are going to be tighter. But at the same time, you will find these slivers that go end to end in the enterprise business process that is going to disrupt the business process, right? So this whole thing, if I have to predict, the whole thing about people coming in to negotiate something, whether it is a contract, whether it is a new idea, whether it is something that they want to improve in their supply chain or on their manufacturing line, it's all going to be assisted by AI. Okay? There are going to be obviously a few areas where this technology will completely replace humans, like autonomous cars. I mean, I can already see that coming. 5 years, 10 years later, I think 90% of the vehicles on most streets, especially the freight vehicles, especially the ones that haul large kind of volumes of freight, are going to be autonomous, right? And you can imagine that even in the traffic in Pune, you're going to see autonomous vehicles because they're going to be smarter and deal with that.
That's a real tough challenge.
It is tough, but it is a percentage of vehicles that go into that ecosystem. If that percentage increases, then obviously the chances of success increase, right? And then it becomes easier. And I think in the enterprise, what is going to happen in extension of that, autonomous is a really more a consumer kind of thing. But in the enterprise, what is going to happen is all of these things which are, high volume and high risk. That quadrant is where AI is going to have the most impact, right?
Good point.
And that is where, so manufacturing processes are already changing, where there is furnaces and steel manufacturing and so on is all by AI driven machinery. You already have lots of image processing in terms of figuring out whether the crop has ripened, whether the fruit is ready to pluck, all of that, from an agro perspective, from a manufacturing perspective, from an insurance perspective. Insurance probably one of the largest consumers of AI that's going to grow to an insane level, where your insurance premium probably might change every day, depending on how you decide to drive today, right? Bottom line, netting it out, I think what is going to happen is the contract, the agreement, what you pay for, what you get is going to be driven near the transaction. Right? Enterprises do 5-year contracts, 3-year contracts. Take your building office lease, a 3-year or a 5-year. Right. People are going to now go 2-day, 3-day, 4-day leases, 5-day leases. That is going to be possible only because there is the right application of AI to determine what's the right way to do it. Where are your people? Where are they going to meet? Where are your customers? Today, next week looks like this. So rent these 5 spaces in Pune in different parts for 5 days. That's the life you're going to look at in the enterprise.
I think that's quite interesting. I think we can talk about a lot more. I was going to ask you about autonomous cars as well, since that's a popular topic for everyone. Let's close on one of your favorite topics that you have talked about in some of our previous discussions, completely unrelated to contract management and enterprise software. I know you're a big gamer, right? Computer gamer, and you've talked about it extensively and how that's a good distraction for you in your 18-hour days. That's a big industry, gaming and entertainment, right? How would that change by 2025, 2030?
That is already changing so much because of AI, right? So Microsoft released their flight simulator game on the 18th of August. After after many years. So the first game I played, the flight simulator version, was in the 90s. Can you believe that?
Same year. I played.
Remember that?
Early in the
FS1, and now they've released it after a decade or more. And the credits when you launch the game, there is obviously Microsoft, there is Asobo, and there is an AI company in there. Right? So the gaming industry is usually a good thermometer of where a technology is going: graphics, CPU, storage.
Oh, definitely. They have been the pioneers in some of these aspects.
Absolutely. And so one other industry that I won't mention, right? So those 2 industries have driven part of the technology. But this is actually very interesting because I don't know if you have ever experienced an Oculus Rift or a HoloLens.
No, not yet. I want to check it out.
You have to come home. This is an Oculus Rift, actually a Quest, which is wireless, right? So it's a PC on its own with virtual reality. And you have to watch, I was watching a 360-degree video of Petra, Jordan. City, right?
The famous the Indiana Jones movie.
Exactly.
Shot there, yeah.
Exactly. it is an incredible experience today. I cannot think where this can go in 25, where I think I won't have to travel. I love traveling. I think with this kind of an experience where all the, the noises, the sounds, the smells, because the factory thing very, very AI driven, right? And obviously the visuals. If I can do that with my family, my friends together, I think.
And they may not be at the same location.
They will be
at different location, enjoying the same vacation together.
Exactly. Right. So I watched a movie together with a couple of friends who also have, and one of them has a and the HTC Vive or Vive, and then one of them has a Oculus Rift, and three of us actually sitting in a movie theater talking to each other in virtual reality. It was quite an experience. I
think we've completely changed topics, but I think this is such an exciting area. I think we should do a separate episode just on gaming and entertainment. And I mean, it's something that is your area of interest, and I'm sure you would have invested a lot of time in studying the technologies behind it as well. So with that, Monish, I think let's close this session with plans for doing this a few more times in the coming months on different topics. Thanks a lot for joining this particular episode, and all the best for Icertis. We Punekars, MCCIA included, are cheerleaders of Icertis as one of the top enterprise software companies of Pune. So wish you all the best.
Thank you so much, and thank you, MCCIA. I love doing this. It's a privilege for me, and it's an honor to be part of this great city as well. So thank you so much, Amit. Have a wonderful day.